I want you to think of a time when you were really tired. And some of you I know are like, yeah, right now. Yeah. Is that what you're going to say right now?
A couple hours ago.
A couple hours
I'm
ago?
good now, but
Okay.
a couple hours ago, I was really tired.
Yeah. Think of the times in your life when you've been the most tired, just the absolute most tired, whether you're like parents of a newborn, for example.
Oh, I know one for Matt.
Oh, yeah?
It was after a lock-in.
Enough said right there. Just after a lock-in, that tells you the whole thing.
A youth lock-in.
Uh-huh.
To be specific, yes.
Is there, I feel like we need to hear this story.
Yeah, that's fine. We went out to eat,
What and breakfast.
and so Matt just gets his check, and he just writes the final number, and then on the tip line, he just writes Matt. And he goes, I'm too tired to figure it out. To which, well, I was saying, to which Caddy, yeah, I think fixed it, but also gave him like the.
We were punished for that later. We
And I
walked
walked
out.
outside and I had a flat tire.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
That's right. I forgot
Brad
about
and
that.
Matt changed in record time by that.
yeah.
It was very commendable.
Oh, my
Matt
goodness.
started Mr. Hard out.
Oh, that's awesome.
But that's tired.
Well,
Flat tire.
I want to tell you a story that is going to make you feel like as tired as you've been, you've probably never been that tired. It's going to be like when you're somewhere and everybody's like giving their testimonies and like, somebody's got like a real hardcore one and then you're like trying to follow that, it's going to feel a little like that. No, but in all seriousness, there's this missionary. Her name was Gladys Aylward, and she was a missionary to China in like the early 1900s. So she was born in 1902. In her 20s, early 20s, she went to China, and that was a big deal. That was a process. Just getting there alive was a struggle, but she finally made it, and kind of getting established was just nonstop struggle, nonstop difficulty. But over time, she was faithful to God. She cared strongly for the people around her and demonstrated that in various ways. She did things that nobody in that culture at that time would ever have done to demonstrate that she loved people, that God loved them. And she ministered in this rural area to these different towns in this region, in this province. And over time, God started to work through her more and more, and she became her ministry was very effective and very successful and fruitful. And there were a lot of people coming to know Christ, both people of low position and high position. It was spreading. She was sharing Christ with people who were then traveling around and spreading it to other places. She was starting started like an inn that eventually turned into an orphanage that turned into just this place of refuge that people would come from miles away. People would send orphaned children from miles away to her because they knew that whoever came through those doors would be taken care of one way or another. And it was always a struggle. They never had enough, but somehow it always worked out. God always provided. And so over time, in the 1930s, starting in the late 1930s, the Japanese invade. They invade China. And over the coming years, the land just gets absolutely ravaged by war. There's bombings of Japanese fighter planes, periodically. There's, Japanese troops coming through and then leaving and coming back again. At one point, the Chinese government establishes a scorched earth policy where they want these civilians living in these areas to ditch their towns and burn every building. And if they can't take an animal with them, kill it. And just basically, when the Japanese come through, leave nothing behind that could help them in any way. And this not only made it harder for these civilians, but also the Japanese soldiers coming in weren't happy about it and punished the civilians for it many times. And Gladys ministered through all of that. And she loved on people through all of that, absolutely self-sacrificial in every possible way and every opportunity. There came a moment where she actually was, there was a bunch of young women, young girls that were living in her, they had established a dormitory because there were all these young women that had no family to go to, and this was a place of refuge they could come. And at one point, these 50 Japanese soldiers came in the middle of the night and went in the room and were going to have their way with them. And Gladys tried to intervene, and she stepped in and got nailed in the side of the head with a rifle and got knocked out and was bleeding from her head for a while, and woke up later, and God rescued the girls. It had everybody was safe in the end. They all started praying to God, and God rescued them in a miraculous way. But anyway, so it comes to this point where Gladys is notified that the Japanese government has literally put a bounty on her head. that she is one of a handful of people in that region that they are actually posting wanted signs that list a reward for her capture, dead or alive, or for information about her whereabouts. And so she finally reaches a point. She stayed in this place long after a lot of other people left, long after everybody kept telling her to leave, that she didn't need to be here. She could go back to England at any time, but she stuck around in this war-torn area for years and years. And then finally, it came to a point where she figured, this not only endangers me, it endangers the people around me. I can't stay anymore, I have to go. But I have 94 children, orphaned children in my care, and I need to get them somewhere. And they had plans to get them to this other town where there were other orphanages, like there was a network of other orphanages, and they were going to get passed on, and they were going to be taken care of, and that didn't work. The guy who was going to take them actually got attacked and killed by Japanese soldiers. And so anyway, it comes to this point. She's going to go to this city called Xi'an, and to get there, she has to go and take, either she's leaving these children behind to literally fend them for themselves, or she's taking them with her. So her plan is to go to this city called Xi'an, and she's going to take 94 children on her own. And these kids range from ages 14 to 15, or I'm sorry, age 4 to 15, right? And so she gets them geared up, she scrounges up any last little bits of food they can find. It's not very much. They all have to carry their own stuff. She tells them, put on every set of clothes you have, wear it. Every pair of shoes you have, tie them around your waist or something. The shoes that they had were like kind of made of like leather and bark. And they were okay, like they'd last maybe a month walking around town, but they're about to be trekking through mountains and rocks. And these shoes are not going to last maybe even a day. But take whatever ones you have. They all have like a mat, like a bed mat that they can roll up. She says, you know, everybody, even down to the youngest kids, the 4-year-olds, have to carry their own bed mat. And the older kids are assigned groups of younger kids to look after and take care of, give them a piggyback ride if they need it. And they embark. And this is going to be a 12-day journey on foot through enemy territory, right? At any time, they could get bombed by Japanese planes, and at one point they almost do. At any point, they could get ambushed by Japanese soldiers. They have very little food and water, and they have to go. They just have to start walking. And so they start walking. They go out, and with prayer and singing songs to God, they go. And at first, you know, the kids, of course, are having fun. They're running around, they're playing, and over time, of course, they get tired. Even that first day, they start getting tired, and they don't have a choice. They've got to just keep going. And she's doing her best to encourage the kids as they go along. And they go through, you know, at different times. You know, she's worried about where are we going to sleep tonight, and miraculously God provides them this great opportunity to, you know, sleep in like a Buddhist temple or something, or people will put them up in their homes. People will give them what little food they can scrounge together for these orphans coming through town with a long way yet to go. At times they're sleeping in caves. At times they're sleeping out in the open. And on they march on. Gladys herself, whenever there's food to go around, she's often not eating because there's so little to go around. She lets the kids have it first. Whenever there's an opportunity to sleep, she's not always willing or able to sleep. And she's having problems. She notices, too, that she's been, ever since that head injury, she's had some issues where she's just more tired more of the time. And she, you know, even when she eats or sleeps, it helps, but it doesn't like completely help like it used to. She's 38 years old, by the way, at this point in time. So she's not exactly elderly or anything. But she's having more and more issues since that rifle to the head that she got. And but they press on. When the kids get discouraged, she has them sing, and they'll come into a village singing Christian hymns, you know, and praying. But she keeps encouraging the kids, and she keeps telling them, we're going to come to the river. When you see, off in the distance, we're going to come over a ridge, and far away we're going to see the Yellow River. And when you see the Yellow River, you know that we're home free. Because all we have to do is go down to that village. We'll stay the night there. Those people are going to feed us. They're going to let us get on boats to cross us over the river. And then from there, it's just a short way to walk to the train station. And the train station, the trains are running all refugees. Any refugees can jump on any southbound train for free. All right, so we just got to get to the train station. We're going to pile onto a train, and that train is going to take us the rest of the way. And the kids have never even seen a train. They've only heard her talk about trains. The only motorized vehicle they've ever seen is Japanese planes flying overhead, bombing them, you know. And so they're excited and nervous about all this, but whenever they're worn out, whenever they're tired, whenever the kids are crying, and sometimes as they walk, there's just at any given time, there's a handful or more of the younger kids just crying. And as they go along, she keeps encouraging them with this, just soon, just a little bit longer, we're going to come over this ridge, we're going to see the Yellow River, and it's all going to be okay. We're going to have everything we need, and it's going to be smooth sailing from there. And so after 12 days of walking, they get to the river, they see the Yellow River in the distance, and all the kids they're exhausted. They're like, we're not going to make it, I can't go any farther. And she says, no, there's the river right there, we just got to keep going. And so she encourages them, and she has them praying, and she has them singing, and this army of 100 kids come into this village singing and praising God. And when they walk into the village, they find it completely empty. All of the people who lived there had abandoned ship days before, except for one elderly gentleman who wanted the opportunity to, as his last act in life, to spit on the Japanese soldiers that killed his sons. And so they find this village empty. And what they do is they spend the night there. They scrounge up whatever food they can find. A lot of it's rotten, but they try to like mix it together and boil it and get kind of a stew going. And they do their best to feed everybody, and they spend the night there. And in the morning, they don't know what they're going to do. And Gladys has no idea what to do at this point. And the guy tells them, too, that the boats are all gone. Once you get to the river, there's no boats left. They took them all. And plus, the Japanese have been bombing along this river because there have been a lot of military movements on boats along the river, so they're just bombing anything they see on the river. And so they go on, they wake up in the morning, they march to the river, and Gladys just says, we're just going to pray, and we're just going to see what God does. And they get there, and she has this moment where they actually get down there, and she's actually like having a hard time staying conscious. She's having a hard time focusing, like she's near to passing out. But they've got to figure something out. We got to get these kids across. And the kids, meanwhile, are saying, well, Gladys, why can't we just walk on the water like Jesus? You know, why can't you part the waters like Moses in these Bible stories you've told us? And she doesn't really have a good answer for that. And they don't know what they're going to do. Well, then she says, okay, everybody pray. Everybody just pray. And they start praying. And all of a sudden, this Chinese soldier comes over a ridge. He hears them praying and singing. And he comes over and he like basically is like, no, you guys got to get out of here. There's no boats. There's nothing we can do for you. And she's like, I've got to get these kids across the river. We've got to get to the train station, get to science, and get them safe. And he says, well, okay, there is one military boat. We have it hidden up the river a little ways. We can get it out for you, but like, I can't promise that you're going to make it across. But they pray about it. They pile on the boat. It takes 3 trips. They get all the kids across the river, and they keep going. They get to another village, they spend the night, they go on to the train station, and they get to the train station, and they get on the train. And actually, as the train pulls up, all 94 kids scatter because they've never seen a train before, and they think it's a giant dragon that's coming to eat them, and they don't want to go in it. And so they all run. And so then she's like, pressed for time, Gladys has to go and round up all these kids wherever they went off hiding and get them on the train. The conductor, the engineer, they give her time, and they get the kids on the train. And for 3 days, they're able to just ride the train down, and it's great. It's relaxing. Everybody's able to rest. There's a little bit of food on the train. The kids are having a good time on it. Once they get past the terror, the first tunnel is real scary for them. But like once they get past that, they're having a good time. It's good. Gladys is able to get some food. She's able to sleep. For the first time, she actually feels comfortable just eating the food that's given to her. And she's able to get a lot of sleep on the train. And even so, she's just like still not feeling right. Like the sleep isn't enough. But she's got to press on. She's got to keep going. And the train stops very abruptly. The train comes, as abrupt as a train can, coming to a stop. They come to a stop in front of this bridge that's been bombed by the Japanese. The bridge is gone. And so the engineer goes along telling everybody the bad news. We can't go any further. The bridge is out. It's been bombed by the Japanese since the last time we were here. So there's nothing we can do. You got to figure it out for yourself. And they're saying, well, what other options are there? And he says, well, if you were to cross over this mountain ridge here, these mountains here, it'd probably take 4 or 5 days on foot. But if you were to cross over these mountains, there's another set of tracks, and you could maybe find a station and hop on another train there and go the rest of the way down. And so Gladys at this point is crying, is sobbing, but what else can they do? After these kids on foot all those days, now they've got to do it again. And their feet are worn and blistered and bleeding. They don't have enough shoes, they don't have enough clothes, they don't have enough food, they don't have enough water, but they go. They have no other choice. She leads the kids over the mountains, again, hiding out, sleeping in caves at night. They get to the other side, they find a train station, and when they get there, they're informed that they are no longer letting any human beings on trains on this track anymore because it goes near the Yellow River and the Japanese keep bombing along there, and so the trains are getting bombed, and so we can't take any people. The only trains that go on this track are trains carrying coal. And so now they're stuck, and they have no option. And Gladys tells the kids, okay, unroll your bed mats, everybody go to sleep, it's late, like everybody just get some sleep. And she sits down and leans against a wall and passes out. And like at this point, she's struggling just to even remain conscious most of the time, but she's been fighting through for the kids, and then now she just collapses, she's unconscious. She gets woken up, though, by these two men, these two train engineers that basically they were bringing their train by, and they stopped at the station, and they saw all these kids sleeping there. They heard these kids crying, and they were moved by it. And so they said, you can ride on top of the coal if you'd like. And so this is in the night. Some of the kids are still asleep, and they're taking little kids still sleeping and putting them on top of the coal. And she's assigning older kids to make sure that some of the younger kids don't roll off the pile of coal when they come around a sharp turn. And they pile up on the coal, and they're trying to like kind of burrow into, because if a Japanese plane flies over and sees that train and they can tell that there are people in it, they might bomb them just for that. Not necessarily realizing it's children, or maybe not even caring. And so, but they pile into the coal, and before long, like they're all covered in coal dust. They're actually pretty well camouflaged with the coal, and now it's just a matter of, are they going to get bombed on the way? But this train takes them all the way, and miraculously, there are no planes over the head the whole time. God provides for them. The kids actually have a good time riding on the coal, as you would expect. They're having fun with it. And they finally, they get to Sian. And again, they get to the city that they have been struggling to get to after like 20 days of this. They finally get to Sian, and they are told, we're not accepting any more refugees because we are overrun with them. Nobody is allowed off any train. There are soldiers standing there making sure nobody gets off of any train that comes through. Now, the conductor is able to pull some strings. The people on the coal train, they say, tell you what, we can take you down to the next town. It's another 3 days. But if you want to, you can ride on this train another 3 days, and we'll go down to the next town. And so they do, and they get there, and Gladys is finally, she is able to get the kids to safety, get them, there are some orphanages that she has connections with. She's able to get them all placed in homes. And 2 days later, she passes out, and she's in a coma for a couple of weeks. And when she finally wakes up, she ends up still in the hospital for another 2 months. The first words out of her mouth when she wakes up are the children safe? And over the next couple of months, she finds herself drifting in and out of consciousness, sometimes very confused about where she is, sometimes thinking she's back home in England with her own family. Whenever she wakes up, the first thing out of her mouth is, are the children safe? Are the children safe? Over time, she recovers. She's much healthier, although she's not in great shape for a 38-year-old. And she goes on to live a long life and continue to have a very fruitful ministry well into her 60s. She lives and continues to do ministry work. She goes back to England eventually for a little while, but goes back to China, where she spends most of her life. So I'll ask you again, what's the most tired you have ever been? And I'm not saying it's a contest. That's not the point. Like it's not a who has it worse. Although we do that, don't we? Right? Like, have you ever made the mistake of going to work and somebody asks how you're doing and you're like, oh, I'm tired? Because you know what happens then. Everybody's like, oh yeah, well, I had to get up at 6. I had to get up at 5. Well, I get up at 2 every morning. I go to bed at 3 and wake up at 2. Like everybody's got to have it worse. Everybody points out how much they need their coffee in the morning. Even though we all know that, everybody's the same on that front, but like everybody feels the need to say it. Right? But the point is, it's not a competition about who's the most tired. The point is, all of us, whether we have had an experience quite on that level or not, all of us feel tired at times. All of us struggle. All of us long for rest. For a time where whatever we are going through right now, we won't have to anymore. Where the journey that we're on, that someday we're going to get there and I won't have to stay on the road like I am. Right? I don't know if I can take another step, but someday I'll get to a place where I don't have to take any more steps. I can sit, I can rest. This heavy load that I'm carrying, this burden, whether emotional or like literally a physical burden, that someday I'm going to get to a place where I don't have to carry this on my back anymore. All of us have felt that way. All of us carry things. And all of us long for a time when we won't have to carry them anymore. When you won't have that job anymore, where you won't have that tension and conflict in that relationship that weighs on you, where you won't have the troubles you're having at work or at home or with your neighbors or with your friends. When you won't be so lonely, when you won't be so depressed, when you won't be so anxious, when you'll finally have enough money. When things, whatever your circumstances are right now, I just need to get older, I just need to get to this point, I just need to get married, I just need to stop being married, I just need to whatever. Like there's something that if I could just get to that point, I'll be okay. All of us long for that, don't we? And no matter how hard the journey is, there's got to be, we lose hope if we don't have a destination. That if I could just get to this point, it'll be okay. And that is very much, if you have ever felt that way, that is very much what Hebrews is written for. Hebrews was written for you. If you are tired, if you are exhausted, Hebrews was written for you. Last week we were looking at chapter 3, where the author of Hebrews is making the argument that Jesus is greater than Moses. He's talking about how faithful a servant Moses was to God, and what God did through Moses, and he's talking about how Jesus, everything Jesus has done is like the culmination. It's like everything Moses started, Jesus has finished. Jesus has completed. Jesus has done everything greater than Moses ever did, which is a big statement, which is meaningful. And he's going to go on to say that just like Moses was leading his people to rest, Jesus leads us to rest. So if you remember the story, right? The Israelites are slaves in Egypt. God does all the plagues and stuff to rescue them from Egypt. They see God at work, and God saves them. They have a salvation moment. And God brings them out of Egypt, and he promises, I'm taking you to this land that I promised to your ancestor Abraham. I'm going to take you there, and everything's going to be fine. I'm going to take care of you. Things will be good there. There will be enough for everybody. There will be enough room for everyone to live in. Everybody will have enough food. Everybody will be okay. All you have to do is trust me. All you have to do is be faithful to me as your God. I'll lead you into this land, and we're going to be okay. And what happens is they got to go through the desert to get there. And as they go through the desert, over and over and over, what we see is people failing to trust God. People losing heart, people saying maybe we had it better off in Egypt, people wanting to turn back and abandon God. And what God says over and over is just trust me, just hang in there, we're going to get there and it's going to be okay. And repeatedly, they ignore God, they defy God. And what happens over and over is when they defy God, when they reject God, God says, okay, you can die in the desert. If that's what you would prefer, rather than going into the land I promised you, you can die in the desert. Even Moses has a moment where he fails to obey God on something, and his punishment is, you will not get to go into the land. You get to go up on a mountain and see it and look at it. This land that you've never been to in your life, but you've heard so much about. You will get to look at it, but you won't even get to go in. Joshua, who's kind of Moses' assistant, his helper, who kind of takes over for him when he's gone, Joshua's going to lead them in. And so finally, they get to the promised land and the people are scared. They're too scared to go in to the land that God promised them, that they came all this way for and went through all that stuff for. And all the stuff God did in Egypt, all the miracles he did in the desert, they get to the land and they don't even want to go in. They don't trust him that they're going to be okay. And God says, fine, walk in the desert another 40 years. And then you'll come back and enter the land, except for Moses, of course. And so they go and they wander for another 40 years in the desert. And that generation largely dies off, and the next generation gets their opportunity to go in, and they're still afraid. There's still a lot of hesitation. Finally, they do go in. And when they go into the land, God provides for them. God does everything he says they're going to do, but it's not the end. Even in this land, God had promised them rest. This land was supposed to be the final destination, and what we see happen throughout the rest of their history is, over and over, they go through these cycles where they defy God, they turn away from God, they stop trusting him, they start trying to go their own way, and it never goes well for them. It never works out. God always says, no, you need to listen to me. If you do listen, here's what I'll do, and if you don't listen, here's what's going to happen. And they don't listen, and it goes exactly the way God told them it would. Right? And this happens over and over and over. So the author of Hebrews is saying Jesus is superior to Moses. Everything he's done is superior to everything Moses has done. Actually, everything Moses did was leading up to, pointing the way to Jesus, but Jesus was the culmination of it all. And then he makes the point very strongly in Hebrews chapter 3, don't be like the people that rebelled against God. Learn from the story of the Israelites way back when in the desert. Don't make the mistakes they did. Trust in God. Do it today. And the author of Hebrews is going to quote extensively from Psalm 95, which is kind of playing on those themes, and he's going to kind of refer to this thing that happens in Numbers where people rebelled against Moses, right? And he picks up in chapter 4 and he says, therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. Now we who have believed enter that rest, just as God has said, so I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. So that quote there is the last line from Psalm 95, which we looked at some more last week. Right, so what he's saying is, there is still a rest here, right? These people entered, like a lot of people entered the rest of the promised land, but a lot did not, right? So he says, since there's still a promise, since there's still an opportunity to enter God's rest, let's make sure we don't fall short of it. Now, what does he mean by that? What's he talking about? So first of all, Jesus is the true and ultimate fulfillment in everything in the Old Testament. That's what the author is going to continue to say. And the same is true of rest here, right? That these people, the Israelites, they had a rest that God was leading them into, right? And he says, in the same way, this was just the starting point. This was just a hint. This was just a foreshadowing of the true rest that was going to come through Jesus eventually. They had good news, or we could say the gospel, proclaimed to them back then, right? They had a salvation moment. God saved them from slavery in Egypt. God established a covenant relationship with them at Sinai through the law. And there was a promise that they would enter into this rest. But not all of them responded to the gospel message with faith. And a lot of bodies littered the desert because of that, right? And he's saying all those same things are true of us. We have been saved from sin, from death, because Jesus died on the cross and rose again, right? We have entered into a covenant relationship with God through Jesus, through the new covenant that he has started in his blood. And there is a promise of rest yet to come, that someday we are going to live forever with God. That we can rest from the weariness, from the difficulty of this life, and we will experience true rest and true peace and true bliss and true security that will never end, that will never diminish, that will never fade. That is what we will have with God for all of eternity. If we hang in there, if we don't make the mistake that they made. Because those Israelites, many of them back then, they trusted God at first, they said yes at first, and later on they gave up. And the author of Hebrews is saying, let's be very careful that we don't make the same mistake. We can be certain that that rest will come if we stay faithful to Jesus. But let's stay faithful. He goes on in continuing in verse 3, he says, and yet his works, God's works that is, have been finished since the creation of the world. For somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day in these words, on the seventh day God rested from all his works. That's in Genesis 2. And again, in the passage above, he says, they shall never enter my rest. Therefore, since it still remains for some to enter that rest, and since those who formerly had the good news proclaimed to them did not go in because of their disobedience, God set a certain day, calling it today. This he did when a long time later he spoke through David, as in the passage already quoted, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. So what's he saying here? He's saying, okay, way back in Genesis, we see God creates the world. The way Genesis 1 and 2 describe it is God creates the world in 6 days. And on the seventh day, God rests. He ceases, he stops from all his work, and he rests, right? And in the same way, later on in the Old Testament law, we're going to see that one of the 10 commandments is you got to keep the Sabbath. You have to have one day a week where you rest. And what does that rest mean? It means it's a day of relaxation. It's a day that you don't work. But also, it's a day of joy. It's a day of celebration. It's a day of remembering everything that God has done for you and just appreciating that, right? And resting in that. Right? But the author is going to make this argument. It's a little bit convoluted, but if you slow down and read this through, you can see where he's coming from here, right? So again, he's referring to Psalm 95, which is basically Psalm 95. This is David, King David, writing in his own generation, basically saying, hey, remember all that stuff that happened with our ancestors going through the desert and coming to the promised land. Let's be careful not to make that mistake again. Today, if you hear his voice, don't make the mistake that our ancestors did. Stay faithful to God no matter what. Right? So what the author is saying is, hold on. What is David talking about? David, inspired by the Holy Spirit to write Scripture, is saying, like, today there's an opportunity to enter God's rest. It's like, well, I thought they already entered the rest when they came into the promised land. Well, that means there is still, bless you, there's still a rest that has yet to occur. And he says this is actually God's own rest that he's inviting us into, right? So the point he's making is basically, look, Joshua did his best to lead the Israelites into the rest that God promised, but there was still a rest to come. That was just like everything else, just a foreshadowing of what was yet to come. That we have a promised land ahead of us. And there's a far greater Joshua who is here to lead us into it. And by the way, there's some wordplay there. So Joshua and Jesus are actually the same name in Hebrew. It's Yeshua or Yehoshua, depending, it's spelled different ways. You know, there's variations, but it's the same name. We pronounce them different today, I know. But Joshua and Jesus are the same name. So he's saying this Joshua back then, boy, he did his best. He led his people into the promised land. Joshua was a great guy. He was obedient to God. And he fulfilled the mission that God gave him. But that was only a foreshadowing of the rest that was yet to come. There is a greater Joshua, a greater Yeshua, who is yet to come, who is going to lead us into a more full rest, a more complete rest, the kind of rest that God rested on the seventh day. And so in that sense, like every day is a new today. There's a new opportunity to enter into God's rest. So he goes on in verse 9. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. Right? Again, he's appealing to this concept of the Sabbath, this idea of rest. This is a part of the rhythm. If you're a Jewish person that's actually practicing the law, this is a part of your weekly rhythm, your routine, is that starting Friday night at sundown until Saturday night at sundown, it is a day of rest where you don't do any labor, right? It is a day of celebration, of prayer, of worship. It is a day to spend with family. It is a day to relax. You stop from everything else. Everything in society should stop. And you just spend time basking in God's presence, basking in the community of people around you, right? And in the same way, he's like this Sabbath, entering the promised land, all these things that are described as rest, these are just a foreshadowing that there is a Sabbath yet to come. There is a day off, right? It has been a long, hard week in this life, but boy, Saturday is coming. Friday night is coming when you can punch out, when you can take the bus home from school, and it's finally the weekend, right? He's saying the weekend is coming. There is a greater weekend, greater than anything we could imagine. There is a place, there is an opportunity that we can go in and experience true security, true peace, where we know that everything's okay, right? This is something both that there's present tense and there's a future tense. And we'll see this a lot in Hebrews, that a lot of the stuff he's talking about, there's a rest that we will experience in the future when we get to live with Jesus for all eternity, but there is also a rest, there is a peace we can experience right now. Just like Philippians 4 says, that God gives us, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, right? And that God will give us a peace that passes all understanding, right? He says there's a peace, there's a rest we can experience right now in the weariness that we experience in life. God provides a rest, God provides a peace that sustains us, that keeps us going. And on the horizon, there is a future hope that we can press on, we can keep walking, because when we get there, it will not disappoint. As Romans 5 says, it's a hope that won't disappoint, that we will reach that rest, that there is a city on the horizon, that when we come over that ridge and we see that city, it's all downhill from here. All we have to do is walk into that city and everything will be okay, and our journey is over. Right? And in this he describes this rest that we get from God as both, if I can use grammatical terms, it's both an indicative and it's an imperative. In verse 3, he says, now we who have believed enter that rest. So he's saying this is just a thing that happens. Those who put their faith in Jesus enter into that rest. But he's also making it an imperative. He's saying, let us therefore, in verse 11, let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. So he's saying there is a reality right now that if you're a follower of Jesus, you are going to enter the rest. Yes. And there's also a warning that there's a contingency there that if we drift away, if we give up on God, if we cease to be faithful to Jesus, we will not enter the rest, just like those Israelites way back when. So what's the point here? The point he's getting at is, I know you're tired. I know you don't think you can take another step. But there is a city. We're getting close. It's just a little while longer before we get there. It'll be here before you know it. We're going to get to this place and everything will be okay. Like the book of Revelation tells us, this will be a place where God wipes away every tear. This will be a place where there is no sickness, no death, no mourning, no sadness of any kind. This will be a place where, most importantly, we get to live in God's presence, where God is at the center of it. And all we do is live in His presence and be around Him more fully than we have ever experienced in this life on earth. There is that hope awaiting us if we will just hold on. I know it's hard. But you know what? This life is short. It goes so fast. This life is so full of trouble, is so full of difficulty and trial. But if we hang on to Jesus, on the other side of this, we enter into His rest. We get to rest with Him. And I know it is a struggle, but there is a rest right now. That when we put our faith in Jesus, when we do things God's way, when we trust Him and obey Him, things go better that way. It's hard, we're tired, but somehow we find the strength to take one more step. That when we trust in God, when we put our faith in Him, He guides us. When we follow Him and do things His way, He guides us in such a way that things work out better and we're able to make it through. And in dark times, we can remember the hope that lays ahead of us. That hope that doesn't disappoint, that we will live with God forever, and that we will have all of eternity to sit back and think about everything that we've been through up to that point, and as we look back to realize that it was all worth it. It's not an easy life. It's not an easy job. Nobody ever said it would be. It's not like following Jesus means everything about your life is going to go exactly the way you want it, according to plan, and you're never going to face trouble. The Bible never says that. It says exactly the opposite. Your life might never get as hard as Gladys's life, leading an army of children through the mountains of rural China. I mean, that's pretty hard. It doesn't get much harder than that, right? Your life might never amount to that level of struggle. But your struggle is real. The struggle is real. Your pain is real. Your pain counts. What you are going through right now, I know you're tired. But we are going to get there, and it's all going to be worth it if we just stay faithful to Jesus. I'm going to close in prayer, and then we're going to kind of do a closing song. And I want to invite you, as we do our last song, to just sit and take some time to pray and reflect. And I want you to reflect on what baggage you're carrying into this room this morning, what you're struggling with right now. And I want you to ask God to give you peace and ask God to give you rest and assurance of the hope that lays ahead of us. Let me close this in prayer, and then we'll do that. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness and your love. We thank you for who you are. Lord, we do ask as we come before you in prayer now, I pray that you would speak to each of us, that whatever it is that we're carrying, that we need your rescue, that we need your rest, I pray that you would give it to us, that you would give us peace, that you would sustain us, and God, that you would help us to have certainty, to have assurance of the true and real hope of the rest that lays ahead of us, the Sabbath that awaits us, the heaven that awaits us, Lord. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.